Welcome. We will conduct a decision-making exercise today. You will have an opportunity to earn some extra money by engaging in this exercise. Please watch carefully and take note of all instructions in this video. Following these instructions carefully might improve your chances of earning more money. You will be playing in a group together with 4 other real people who also accepted to participate in this exercise. Please focus on this decision exercise. Please refrain from doing other activities during the exercise so that you're not distracted. Never click Go Back or the Reload button. Do not close this window or leave this exercise's web pages in any other way. This can disrupt the exercise and we will not be able to pay you. Now, the money you can make from this exercise is as follows. You can earn $1 for watching the video instructions and taking a short quiz. You can also earn a bonus of $1.50 by completing the exercise until the end without interruptions. In addition, you can earn more, up to an extra of about $10 by making decisions. This extra money you will be paid depends on the tokens you will collect for making decisions. The more tokens you earn, the more money you will be paid at the end of the decision exercise. Please note that in this exercise, each token is worth 5 cents. You will participate in this exercise as part of a group of 5 participants. Your group has been formed by randomly assigning you to 4 other real participants. Also, remember this. The amount of money you earn from this exercise will depend on the decisions made by you and the other members of your group. Finally, you will not know who those other persons are, and they will not know who you are. Everyone will be anonymous. Now, let me tell you a little about the exercise. This exercise mimics decisions that people make in economic activities around a river. In this exercise, there is a river, and this river provides certain benefits such as water supply, transportation, and the accessibility to trade opportunities. So, by being near the river, one can more easily access these benefits and, thus, have greater potential for economic gain. But note that there is also unpredictable fluctuations in the peak water level of the river during wet season. So, being near the river also means, although not always, a possibility of exposure to flooding. In this exercise, you and other members of your group will make decisions around this river. For example, you can choose to invest in economic activities in an area far from the river. Investing in this area means that you get a modest economic return that is fixed and unaffected by the fluctuations in the peak river height. You can also choose to invest in the riverside or near the river. In this case, you get a much higher economic return because of the advantages of being near the river. But note that your economic return can be affected because of the fluctuations in the peak river height. If you choose to invest near the river, then you will also need to decide how to allocate the investment between the maintenance of a public levee infrastructure and your own economic activities for private earnings. Note that the public levee infrastructure can contain the unpredictable fluctuations in the peak river height to an extent during wet season. Thus, the better maintained the public levee infrastructure is, the better protected is everyone's investment to the riverside. However, if it turns out that the river height exceeds the levee height, then flooding happens and all players who invested in the riverside will face a reduction in their earnings. More specifically, at the beginning of each round, each player is given 10 tokens. Players have 2 main options on how to use these 10 tokens. First, players can use all 10 tokens to invest far, or invest in economic activities in the area far from the river. Because of the location, players are unaffected by the fluctuations in peak river height. So, the benefit that the players receive is fixed. In this case, the players get a fixed return of 11 tokens. Second, players can use a slider to determine how much of their investment will go to activities near the river. Players can decide how much of their 10 tokens to invest in private economic activities while the rest goes to public levee infrastructure. The economic return from private activities near the river can be greater than that of the invest far option. However, because of the fluctuations in peak river height during wet season, the earnings that players receive can also fluctuate. This happens when the peak river height exceeds the levee height. More specifically, the amount of tokens invested to this option is multiplied by 4 and then returned to the players. However, if flooding happens, this amount will be reduced. The more severe the flooding, the more reduced the earnings will be. On the other hand, the public levee infrastructure can provide protection to anyone who invested to economic activities near the river because the amount of tokens invested to the levee will lead to an increase in the levee height. Although a player who invests to the public levee infrastructure does not gain private economic return, it can benefit everyone who invested to economic activities near the river by containing peak river height to an extent. Note also that the public levee infrastructure naturally declines or wears down with time and use. So here, the levee height will be reduced by a certain amount at every time step. This means that a continued investment is needed to regularly maintain the levee height. It is crucial to see that investments by multiple players are needed to counter the natural wear down of the infrastructure. Finally, note that you and 4 other players will play the situation just described, for multiple rounds throughout the decision exercise. Now, here is more information about the peak river height and flood severity. At the beginning of each round, when you make investment decisions, the peak river height is unknown. It will be known during wet season of each round, which is after you make investment decisions. There is unpredictable fluctuations in the peak water level of the river during wet season. If it turns out that the peak river height is less than or equal to the levee height, there is no flooding and no flood loss. In this case, players who invested to near the river will have their earnings remain intact. If it turns out that the peak river height is greater than the levee height, there is flooding and flood loss occurs. In this case, players who invested to near the river will have their earnings get reduced by a certain percentage, depending on the severity of the flooding. Now let's talk more about the public levee infrastructure. The total amount of tokens invested into the levee maintenance, which we call levee stock, has a direct relationship with levee height and is defined by this table. Note that you will always have access to this table during the exercise, so you don't need to remember it. At the beginning of each round, players will have an opportunity to invest to public levee infrastructure. For example, assume that you begin a round knowing that the current levee stock is 55 tokens. As you can see in the table, the levee stock of 55 tokens is associated with 6 feet of levee height. Now let's assume that in this round, players collectively invested 25 tokens into the public levee infrastructure. Now, the levee stock is increased to 80 tokens, that is, the existing stock of 55 tokens plus the new investment of 25 tokens. Based on the table, you can see levee height is now 12 feet. Also, as mentioned before, the public levee infrastructure will naturally decline or wear down with time in use. So, at the end of each round, the levee stock will be reduced by 20 tokens, and as a result, the levee height will also be reduced correspondingly. For example, if you finish a round with the levee stock of 70 tokens, the levee stock will be subsequently reduced by 20 tokens because of natural wear down. As a result, you will start the next round with the levee stock of 50 tokens. That is, the 70 tokens minus the natural decline of 20 tokens. Note that flood severity is the difference between river height and levee height. For example, in a given round, if the peak river height turns out to be 18 feet and the levee height is 12 feet, then the flood severity is calculated as the difference of these two numbers and is equal to 6 feet. The relationship between flood severity and flood loss is determined by this table that you will always have access to. In the same example, as you can see, the flood severity of 6 feet is associated with flood loss of 50%. This means that earnings from investing to economic activities near the river will be reduced by 50%. For example, assume that a player earns 20 tokens from investing near the river before the wet season. If there is no flooding, that earning of 20 tokens will remain unchanged even after the wet season. If there is flooding and the flood severity is 6 feet, which equates to the flood loss of 50%, the player will receive 20 tokens times 1 minus 0.5, or 10 tokens, as his or her net earnings after the wet season. Please note that there is a time constraint for decision making in each round. All players need to make a decision within 1 minute. If you don't decide within 1 minute, you will see a warning message. If you need more time, you can click the continue button in the warning message to get an additional minute to make your decision. If you don't make any decision after this additional time, you will be removed from the experiment. That concludes our brief explanation of this decision exercise. Great work! Before starting, we would like you to test your understanding of this decision exercise with a short quiz. You will also have the opportunity to play 2 practice rounds. After the practice rounds, you and 4 other players will play actual rounds of this decision exercise.